The heat of mercy. Behind Fletcher's butcher shop, where flies gathered thick in the evening heat, 5 barefoot children stood like ghosts in the settling dust. Their mother held an infant against her hollow chest, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "May we have your leftovers, sir?" Ethan Cole had stopped hearing his own heartbeat years ago, until that moment, when a 6-year-old girl with dirt-streaked cheeks looked straight through him with eyes that had already learned not to hope. The town of Ridgeway had walked past this family for 3 days. He was about to become the first man to stop. What happens when one act of decency becomes the most dangerous thing a man can do? Stay with us until the end of this story, and please, leave a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale of courage and unexpected family has traveled. The Wyoming Territory's summer of 1887 pressed down on Ridgeway like an iron skillet left too long on the fire. Ethan Cole felt it through his shirt as he walked the half-mile from his ranch into town, dust coating his boots in a fine powder that never quite shook free. 34 years old, and he moved like a man considerably older, shoulders carrying weight that had nothing to do with the sack of grain he'd pick up from Morrison's. The main street lay quiet in the pre-dusk hour. Shop windows threw amber light onto the boardwalk. Ethan nodded to Mrs. Patterson sweeping her porch, received a tight smile in return, the kind reserved for men who lived alone too long and were expected to stay that way. He'd grown accustomed to it. 3 years since Sarah's fever, 2 since her mother followed her to the cemetery on the hill, and the town had wrapped his grief around him like a shroud, deciding it suited him better than hope. He collected his grain from Morrison without much conversation, picked up nails from the hardware store with even less. The butcher shop came last, Fletcher's place at the end of the street where the buildings grew shabbier, and the boardwalk gave way to packed earth. Jonas Fletcher stood behind his counter, cleaver in hand, working through a side of beef with the mechanical precision of a man who'd done the same job for 20 years. He glanced up when the bell rang. "Cole." "Fletcher, got that order?" "Wrapped and ready." Fletcher jerked his chin toward a package on the counter. "Credit's running a bit long, though." Ethan pulled coins from his pocket, counted them onto the scarred wood. "That square us?" Fletcher swept the money into his palm, nodded once. "Through end of month." The transaction complete, Ethan gathered his package. He was turning toward the door when Fletcher spoke again, voice lower. "You heading straight back?" Something in the tone made Ethan pause. "Planning to. Why?" Fletcher wiped his hands on his apron, not meeting Ethan's eyes. "Got some situation out back. Been there since yesterday. Thought someone ought to know." "Situation?" "Drifters. Woman and some kids." Fletcher's jaw worked. "I told them to move on, but..." He shrugged, the gesture saying what his words wouldn't, that he'd told them, they hadn't listened, and it wasn't his problem beyond that. Ethan stood very still. "They causing trouble?" "Not trouble exactly, just being there, in the alley behind the shop." Fletcher returned to his beef, cleaver striking wood. "Figured the sheriff ought to know, but he's up in Casper till Friday." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with implication. Drifters behind a shop, no sheriff in town, and Fletcher making sure someone else knew about it. Someone else could deal with it. Ethan felt the familiar tug of wanting to walk away, to let the world handle its own problems while he managed the small circle of land and animals and silence that made up his life. He made it as far as the door. The evening light hit him full in the face when he stepped onto the street, and something in it, the particular gold of dust suspended in summer heat, pulled a memory loose. Sarah, at 4 years old, standing in just that kind of light, asking him why people slept in the street when there were empty rooms in houses. He'd given her some answer about complicated adult reasons, and she'd looked at him with a child's perfect clarity and said, "That seems mean, Papa." Ethan shifted the package under his arm and walked around the side of Fletcher's shop. The alley ran narrow between buildings, thick with shadows the evening sun couldn't penetrate. Trash barrels lined one wall, and the smell of old meat and rotting vegetables hung heavy in the still air. At first, Ethan thought Fletcher had been mistaken. The alley appeared empty. Then he saw the movement near the back wall. They'd made themselves as small as possible, pressed into the corner where building met fence. 5 children ranging from perhaps 10 years down to a toddler who couldn't have been more than 2. Their mother sat with her back against the wall, an infant sleeping in her arms, her face tilted up at the sound of his boots on packed earth. Ethan stopped 10 feet away, suddenly uncertain of what exactly he'd come to do. The woman didn't move, but her eyes tracked him with the wariness of something that had learned to measure threat quickly and accurately. She looked young, maybe 25, but worn in the way that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with how those years had been spent. Her dress had been mended so many times the original fabric barely showed through the patches. The children clustered closer to her, the oldest, a girl with dark hair and her mother's watchful eyes, positioning herself slightly in front of the smaller ones. "Evening," Ethan said, because the silence had grown too large. "Evening," the woman's voice came out rough, like she hadn't used it much lately. She swallowed, tried again. "We're not causing trouble. We'll move on come morning." "Fletcher said you've been here since yesterday." "Day before." She said it matter of fact, no apology in it. "We're resting. Then we'll go." Ethan glanced at the children. They stared back with expressions too old for their faces. The smallest girl had her thumb in her mouth. The toddler leaned heavily against his mother's side, eyes half closed with exhaustion that went beyond needing sleep. "Where are you headed?" The woman's jaw tightened. "North. My sister's in Montana. She'll take us in once we get there." Montana was 300 miles of rough country away. Ethan looked at their bare feet, the way the children's clothes hung loose on frames that had missed too many meals. 300 miles might as well have been 3,000. "That's a long walk." "We'll manage." Pride threaded through the words, thin but unbroken. Ethan shifted his package to the other arm. The sensible thing would be to walk away now, let the sheriff handle it when he returned. These weren't his people, weren't his problem. He had a ranch to run, cattle to tend, and enough ghosts of his own without inviting in someone else's troubles. The oldest girl was still watching him, her gaze level and assessing. Something in her expression, the way she held herself ready to protect siblings she had no power to actually protect, reminded him so sharply of Sarah that his chest constricted. "When did you last eat?" The question came out before he'd decided to ask it. The woman's chin lifted slightly. "We're fine." "That's not what I asked." A long pause, then quietly. "Yesterday. Fletcher gave us some scraps from the shop." She paused. "We were grateful for it." Yesterday. Ethan felt something hot and uncomfortable move through his chest. Behind this shop for 2 days, while the town went about its business. "Wait here," he said. He walked back around to the front of Fletcher's shop, pushed through the door. Fletcher looked up from his work, eyebrows rising. "Need something else?" "What's your scrap pile look like today?" Fletcher's expression shifted, understanding dawning. "Coal I already gave them. I'm buying it. Whatever you've got that's still good enough to eat. Bones for soup, trim, whatever you'd normally throw out. That's not—" Fletcher stopped, studied Ethan's face. Whatever he saw there made him set down his cleaver. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure about paying for food. You got some or not?" Fletcher moved slowly, wrapping items in butcher paper with more care than scraps usually warranted. He pushed the package across the counter. "No charge." "I'm paying." "Coal." Fletcher's voice went quiet. "Feeding them just encourages them to stay. Come Friday, sheriff's going to run them out anyway. Save your money." Ethan pulled out coins, set them precisely on the counter. "The food, Fletcher." The butcher's mouth pressed into a thin line, but he took the money. Ethan gathered the package and walked back to the alley. The family hadn't moved. The woman watched him approach with an expression caught between hope and suspicion, like someone who'd learned that kindness often came with prices she couldn't afford to pay. Ethan set the package down on the ground, midway between himself and the family. "It's not much, but it's yours if you want it." The woman stared at the package. "Why?" "Because you asked for leftovers, and a man ought to answer when he's asked a direct question." She didn't move toward the food. "What do you want for it?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Ethan felt the ripples of it, understanding what she was really asking, what she'd probably been asked before in exchange for help. The heat of anger moved through him, not at her, but at whatever had taught her to expect that particular transaction. "Nothing," he said flatly. I want nothing except for those kids to eat something. The oldest girl looked at her mother, a question in her eyes. The woman studied Ethan's face for a long moment, weighing something he couldn't name. Finally, she gave a small nod. The girl darted forward, grabbed the package, retreated back to her siblings. The woman's hands shook slightly as she helped unwrap it, distributing portions with careful precision, the children first, herself last and least. Ethan watched them eat, the desperate quiet of it, the way they tried not to wolf it down too fast and failed. The toddler gnawed on a piece of fatty trim, grease shining on his chin. The baby woke and fussed, and the mother shifted to nurse him with a practiced motion that suggested she'd gotten very good at doing multiple things at once. When the food was gone, the woman looked up at him again. "Thank you." "You got water?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "There's a pump behind Morrison's store. Public use. You know where that is?" "We know where it is." She said it carefully, and Ethan understood. They knew where it was, but they'd learned that public didn't always mean for people like them. "I'll walk you over. Make sure there's no confusion." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Ethan picked up his package of meat. "But I'm going that direction anyway." It wasn't true. Morrison's was back the way he'd come. But she didn't argue. She gathered the children with quiet efficiency, the oldest taking the toddler's hand, the next oldest picking up a small bundle that seemed to contain everything they owned. They walked through town as the last light faded from the sky. Lamps flickered on in windows. Ethan felt eyes tracking them from doorways and porches, felt the weight of judgment settling over the small procession. Martha Henderson paused in lighting her porch lamp to stare. Thomas Wright stopped mid-conversation with his neighbor, mouth falling open slightly. Ethan kept his gaze forward and his pace steady. The woman walked beside him with her head up, refusing to shrink from the stairs. The children stayed close, a tight unit of mutual protection. At Morrison's, Ethan worked the pump while the family drank from cupped hands, water spilling down their chins and dampening their clothes. The woman filled a battered canteen, stoppered it carefully, tucked it into her bundle. "Thank you," she said again. "We'll be gone in the morning. We won't cause you any trouble." Ethan looked at the children, at the way the smallest girl swayed on her feet, exhausted beyond what water and one meal could fix. He thought about his ranch, 3 miles out of town. The barn with its empty horse stalls since he'd sold off half his string last fall. The well with cold, clean water, the root cellar still half full from last year's harvest. He thought about Sarah asking why people slept in the street when there were empty rooms. "How long you been walking?" The woman's shoulders tensed. "Week and a half, since Laramie." 150 miles, on foot, with 5 children and an infant. Jesus Christ. "You planning to walk all the way to Montana?" "Like I said, we'll manage. In bare feet." He said it flat, letting the impossibility of it sit between them. Her jaw tightened. "We'll manage," she repeated, and he heard the steel beneath the exhaustion. Ethan was quiet for a moment, weighing what he was about to do against everything that made sense, everything that was safe and distant and uninvolved. Then he thought about sleeping in his empty house tonight, knowing that these children were sleeping in an alley, and something in his chest simply refused to allow it. "I've got a barn, 3 miles north on the Ridge Road. Nothing fancy, but it's dry and there's straw for bedding. You're welcome to it for a few days until you're rested enough to travel proper." The woman stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've got a barn that's not being used, and you've got children who need to sleep somewhere besides an alley." He shifted his package. "That's reason enough." "We can't pay you." "I'm not asking you to pay me." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion so deep it had to have been earned the hard way. "Nobody does something for nothing." "I'm not nobody. I'm just a man with an empty barn and enough sense to know when it ought to be put to use." He paused. "If you'd rather stay here, that's your choice. But the offer stands." She looked at her children, weighing risks he could only imagine. Finally, she said, "What's your name?" "Ethan Cole." "I'm Mara Lane. These are my children, Clara, James, Lily, Thomas, Samuel, and the baby is Daniel." The formality of the introductions felt important, like a line being drawn between charity and something closer to respect. Ethan nodded to each child in turn. Clara, the oldest, watched him with the same measuring gaze she'd had in the alley. James, maybe 8, stood with his shoulders back like a soldier at attention. Lily and Thomas huddled together, maybe 6 and 4. Samuel, the toddler, had fallen asleep against Mara's hip. "Pleased to meet you," Ethan said, and meant it. Mara took a breath. Let it out slowly. "If we come to your barn, we work for our keep. I can cook, clean, mend. The children can help with chores. We don't take charity." "It's not charity. It's a barn." "It's not just a barn, and we both know it." She met his eyes dead on. "If we come, we work. That's the only way this happens." Ethan recognized the pride in it, the need to maintain some measure of control in a situation where she had almost none. He nodded. "All right. You work if you want to work, but the barn's yours either way, for as long as you need it." The walk out to the ranch took an hour in the dark, the children flagging halfway through. Ethan ended up carrying Samuel while James carried Daniel, and Clara helped Thomas when he stumbled. The ridge road climbed gradually through scrub grass and sage, the smell of summer earth rising around them. When the ranch house came into view, Mara stopped. It wasn't much, a simple frame house with a porch, a barn that had seen better days, a chicken coop, and corrals that stretched into the darkness. But after days in an alley, it must have looked like something close to salvation. "The barn's around back," Ethan said. "I'll get you settled." He lit a lantern, led them through the barn doors into the dusty, sweet smell of old hay and leather. 3 stalls stood empty, straw piled in the corner. It wasn't a house, but it was shelter, solid roof, walls that would keep out wind and rain, and space enough for a family to spread out. Mara set Daniel down carefully, looked around with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. The children clustered close, eyes wide and uncertain. "There's blankets in the house," Ethan said. "I'll bring them out, and I can get a fire going in the stove here, heat some water if you want to wash up." "We'll manage," Mara said quietly. Then, softer. "But thank you for the blankets and the water." Ethan made 2 trips to the house, bringing blankets that still smelled of cedar and lavender. Sarah's mother's blankets, untouched since her death. He brought a basin and towels, a bar of soap, a jug of milk from the cold cellar. He started a small fire in the barn's old wood stove, filled a pot with water to heat. The children watched him work with the wariness of small animals uncertain whether to bolt. Only Clara seemed to relax slightly, her shoulders dropping an inch as the barn warmed and the reality of shelter settled around them. "There's eggs in the coop," Ethan said when the water was hot. "Help yourself in the morning. Chicken scratches in the bin there. They'll need feeding." "We'll take care of it," Mara said. Ethan nodded. He stood for a moment, uncertain how to end this strange evening, whether to say more or whether words would just complicate what was simple. They needed shelter, he had shelter, and everything else could wait until morning. "Sleep well," he finally said. "Mr. Cole." Mara's voice stopped him at the door. When he turned, she was standing with Daniel in her arms, her other children gathered around her like planets in orbit. "Why did you really do this?" The question deserved an honest answer. Ethan thought about Sarah's question and the years of silence and the feeling that had gone through him when Clara had looked at him in the alley with eyes that expected nothing and hoped for everything. "Because I could," he said simply. And that seemed like reason enough. He walked back to the house, let himself in, stood for a moment in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of bread and herbs, though no one had baked here in 2 years. Through the window, he could see the faint glow of the lantern in the barn, and the shapes of the family settling into their temporary home. Ethan made himself coffee, sat at the table, and thought about what he'd just invited into his life. The town would have opinions. They always did. Sheriff Blake would have questions when he returned Friday. And Mara Lane, with her fierce pride and her 6 children and her determination to walk 300 miles on bare feet to a sister in Montana, would likely be gone before any of it became a real problem. It was temporary. Just a few days of shelter before they moved on. He told himself that, knowing even as he thought it, that temporary had a way of becoming permanent when you stopped paying attention. But the barn had been empty too long, the ranch too quiet, and when he closed his eyes, he could still see Clara's face in that alley, the look of a child who'd learned to expect nothing but refused to stop hoping anyway. In the barn, Mara Lane settled her children into blankets that smelled of someone else's life. They were warm for the first time in days, full for the first time in longer, and safe for the first time in so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. She listened to their breathing slow and even into sleep, Daniel nursing at her breast, and tried to understand the man who'd walked them here expecting nothing in return. It didn't make sense. In her experience, men always wanted something, payment in coin or labor or other things she refused to think about. But Ethan Cole had looked at her children with something that might have been recognition, offered help with no strings visible, and then walked away like it was the most natural thing in the world. Mara didn't trust it, couldn't afford to. But as the warmth from the stove seeped into her bones and exhaustion pulled her towards sleep, she allowed herself one small, dangerous thing. She let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally met someone who saw her family as people worth helping, not problems to be solved or moved along. Outside, the Wyoming summer night settled deep and quiet over the ranch. Cicadas sang in the grass. A half-moon hung low over the ridge. And in a house and a barn 3 miles from town, two people who'd been walking alone for too long lay awake wondering what the morning would bring. Dawn came early, light spilling through the barn's high windows and shafts that caught dust motes floating lazy in the still air. Ethan had been awake since before sunrise, habit pulling him from bed the way it had every morning for 30 years. He'd fed the cattle, checked the water troughs, and was halfway through mending a section of fence when he heard the first sounds from the barn. Children's voices, hushed but animated. The cluck and flutter of chickens being fed. A woman's low murmur, giving instructions. He finished hammering the rail into place, gathered his tools, and walked back toward the house. The barn door stood open. Clara emerged carrying an egg basket, moving with the careful precision of someone entrusted with something precious. She saw him and stopped, uncertainty crossing her face. "Morning," Ethan said. "Morning, Mr. Cole." Her voice came out formal, rehearsed. "Mama said we should feed the chickens. I hope that's all right." "That's fine. They'll appreciate the attention." Clara shifted the basket to her other arm. "There were 14 eggs. Mama said to bring them to you. Keep half for yourselves. You'll need breakfast." The girl's eyes widened slightly. "Mama said, your mama can argue with me herself if she's got objections." Ethan softened his tone. "But growing children need to eat, and those chickens produce more than I can use anyway." Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded. She started back toward the barn, paused, turned. "Thank you, for last night, for all of it." She disappeared inside before he could respond. Ethan continued to the house, started coffee, sliced bacon into his iron skillet. He was setting the table when a knock came at the door, so soft he almost missed it. Mara stood on the porch, Daniel on her hip, the other children arranged behind her like stair steps. She'd washed their faces and hands, attempted to tame hair with water and effort. They looked scrubbed and anxious, dressed in their mended clothes and wearing expressions of determined politeness. "Mr. Cole," Mara's chin lifted, "we wanted to thank you properly and to discuss terms." "Terms." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "For our stay. What you need done, what hours we work, how long you'll allow us to remain." Ethan looked at the children, at the way Thomas gripped James's hand, at how Samuel had his thumb in his mouth despite being old enough to know better. He thought about the conversation he'd planned to have. Practical, businesslike, establishing clear boundaries and expectations. Then he smelled the bacon burning. Damn! He turned back into the kitchen, rescued the skillet from the heat. When he looked up, Mara had followed him inside, the children trailing after her like ducklings, their eyes wide at the sight of the kitchen with its pump and stove and shelves lined with dishes. "You can't just walk into someone's house," Mara said sharply to them. "I didn't say they couldn't." Ethan gestured to the table. "Sit. We'll talk terms over breakfast." "Mr. Cole, we couldn't possibly." "You can, and you will. I've cooked enough for an army here, and it's poor manners to let food go to waste." Mara's jaw worked, pride and hunger warring across her face. Hunger won. She nodded once, and the children scrambled to the table with barely restrained eagerness. Ethan served bacon, eggs scrambled with butter, toast from bread he'd baked 2 days prior. He poured milk for the children, coffee for himself and Mara. The family ate with the careful control of people who'd learned to make food last, but he could see the effort it took to maintain that control. "When did you last have a hot meal?" he asked Mara. She swallowed a bite of toast, met his eyes. Laramie, before we left. 10 days. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He pushed the bacon platter toward Clara. Have more. They did. When the food was gone and the children's cheeks had regained some color, Mara folded her hands on the table and returned to business. We need to establish expectations. I can cook, clean this house, do laundry, mend clothing and linens. Clara's old enough to help with most household tasks. James can handle livestock feeding, egg collection, basic stable work. The younger ones can weed gardens, haul water within their capacity. She recited it like a resume, like someone who'd had to prove her worth too many times to count. Ethan sipped his coffee, let her finish. In exchange, Mara continued, you provide shelter in the barn, and if you're willing, enough food to keep us fed while we work. We'll stay until... She paused, calculating something he couldn't see. Until we've worked off the debt of the shelter and meals. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. And then? Then we continue to Montana. Ethan set down his cup. You'll walk 300 miles because your sister might take you in. She will take us in. When did you last hear from her? Mara's expression shuddered. 2 years ago, but she's family. She won't turn us away. 2 years was a lifetime when circumstances could change. People moved, died, married, and divorced, fell on hard luck themselves. But Ethan could see in Mara's face that she'd built her entire plan on this single fragile hope, and he wasn't cruel enough to tear it down with logic. All right, he said. Here's what I propose. You stay in the barn as long as you need. You help around the ranch if you're inclined, but it's not required and there's no debt to work off. When you're rested and ready to move on, I'll drive you to the train station in Casper, buy you tickets north. Mara stared at him. Why would you do that? Because putting you on a train makes more sense than watching you walk 300 miles through territory that'll kill you before you make it halfway. We don't need... Yes, you do. He said it flat, no room for argument. And you know it. Pride's a fine thing, Mrs. Lane, but it's a poor substitute for survival. Her hands clenched on the table. I won't be beholden. Then don't be. Consider it payment for whatever work you do around here. God knows this place could use a woman's touch. It was the wrong thing to say. He saw that immediately in the way her spine went rigid. I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm not asking you to. Ethan kept his voice level. I'm offering practical help in exchange for practical work. Nothing more, nothing less. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of Samuel sucking his thumb and Daniel fussing softly. Finally, Mara spoke, her voice careful. 1 month. We'll stay 1 month, help with whatever needs doing, and then you'll take us to Casper for the train. Agreed. And we sleep in the barn, not the house. The barn's yours. She nodded slowly, something in her shoulders relaxing a fraction. Then we have an understanding. They shook on it, her hand small and rough with calluses in his. The children watched the gesture with solemn attention, like they understood they were witnessing something important. After breakfast, Mara proved she hadn't exaggerated her capabilities. She cleaned the kitchen with efficient thoroughness, organized shelves that had devolved into chaos, scrubbed surfaces Ethan hadn't realized were dirty. Clara helped, the two of them moving in synchronized routine that spoke of long practice. James followed Ethan out to the barn, silent but attentive. Ethan showed him how to measure feed, how to check water levels, where to find tools, and how to return them to their proper places. The boy absorbed information like dry earth soaking up rain, nodding seriously at each instruction. You've done ranch work before, Ethan observed. Some. Before... James trailed off, then rallied. Before we left. Left where? The boy's face closed. Doesn't matter now. Ethan didn't push. Whatever had driven Mara Lane to walk out of Laramie with 6 children and nothing but a bundle of possessions, it wasn't his business unless she chose to make it so. By midday, the ranch had taken on a different quality, not just inhabited, but alive. Lily and Thomas pulled weeds in the kitchen garden under Clara's supervision. Samuel played in the dirt near the porch, making roads for a wooden horse Ethan had found in the barn. Mara hung laundry on the line, sheets and shirts snapping in the hot wind. Ethan worked on fixing the barn door hinge, aware of the sounds around him in a way he hadn't been for years. Children's laughter, a woman humming while she worked, the ordinary music of a family going about its day. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. That evening, he brought a sack of potatoes and carrots from the root cellar. Mara took them without comment, and an hour later the smell of stew filled the air. She brought him a bowl at the house, served the children in the barn. "You should eat with us," Ethan said. "We're fine where we are." "It's not about fine, it's about—" He stopped, uncertain what it was about. Something to do with breaking bread together, with not letting them remain separate and other, with extending the boundaries of hospitality beyond shelter and food. Mara seemed to understand what he couldn't articulate. "We appreciate everything you've done, Mr. Cole, but we're not your family. It's important we remember that." She was right, of course. They weren't his family. They were temporary guests who'd be gone in a month, but the house felt different when he ate alone that night. Not peaceful, but empty. And the barn glowed with lamplight and the murmur of children settling into bedtime, and Ethan found himself standing at his kitchen window, watching that distant light longer than was strictly necessary. The days developed a rhythm. Ethan rose before dawn, worked the ranch, found himself teaching James the things a father teaches a son: how to rope a fence post, how to read weather in the sky, how to approach a spooked horse. Mara transformed the house from functional to clean, organized, almost welcoming. Clara proved to have a gift with the chickens, coaxing them into laying more eggs than Ethan had seen in months. Even Samuel made himself useful, fetching tools and carrying messages between house and barn, with the importance of someone given a real job. But it was the evenings that caught Ethan off guard. After the work was done and supper eaten, the children would emerge from the barn to play in the yard. Their laughter reached him through open windows as he sat with his coffee, ledgers spread before him in a pretense of reviewing accounts. One evening, Thomas appeared at his door, holding something cupped in his small hands. "Mr. Cole, I found a baby bird. It can't fly yet." Ethan set aside his pencil, examined the nestling. "Fell out of its nest, most likely. Can we save it?" The practical answer was no. Most fallen nestlings died despite best efforts. But Thomas looked at him with such desperate hope that Ethan found himself nodding. "We can try. Need to make it a nest, keep it warm, feed it every few hours." Thomas's face lit up. "I can do that. I can feed it and everything." They fashioned a nest from a small box and cotton, mixed up a paste of bread and water. Thomas carried the box back to the barn like he was transporting precious cargo, and Ethan heard him explaining to his siblings about feeding schedules and keeping the bird warm. Mara came to the door an hour later. "You didn't have to do that. Give him hope for something that'll probably die." "Probably," Ethan agreed, "but maybe not. And the trying matters." She studied him in the failing light. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd want something in return, or someone who'd make us feel grateful every moment, or someone who'd—" She stopped. "Who'd what?" "Nothing. It doesn't matter." But her expression suggested it mattered very much. "The children are getting attached to this place, to the routine." "That a problem?" "It is when we're leaving in 3 weeks." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "They seem happy. Happy doesn't pay debts or put roofs over heads." Mara wrapped her arms around herself despite the evening heat. "Happy is dangerous when it's built on someone else's charity." "It's not charity. We had an agreement. An agreement that benefits us far more than you." "Maybe I'm getting more out of it than you think." She shook her head slowly. "This isn't your burden to carry, Mr. Cole. We'll be gone soon, and you can go back to your quiet life." She turned and walked back to the barn before he could tell her that the quiet had stopped feeling peaceful somewhere around the time he'd found them in Fletcher's alley, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted it back. On Sunday, Ethan hitched the wagon and drove into town for supplies. He returned to find the ranch transformed. The porch had been swept clean, shutters straightened, windows washed until they gleamed. Inside, the house smelled of lemon oil and beeswax. Fresh bread cooled on the counter. Mara had even tackled the parlor, dusting furniture that hadn't been touched in 2 years. She stood in the kitchen, flour on her apron, looking uncertain when he walked in. "I hope I didn't overstep. You said the house needed a woman's touch, and I thought—" It looks good. Ethan set down the supply boxes, glanced around. Better than it has in years. Relief crossed her face. I made extra bread for the barn. Keep it all. I bought bread in town. A lie. He'd bought flour and sugar, coffee and salt, more eggs than one man needed. Things that could stretch to feed 8 people without it seeming deliberate. Mara's eyes narrowed. Mr. Cole, Ethan, after 2 weeks of you cooking my meals and cleaning my house, I think we can dispense with formality. Mr. Cole, she repeated firmly, you're buying too much food. I'm buying what I need. No one needs 20 pounds of flour and 15 pounds of sugar. Winter's coming. I like to stock up early. It's June. I plan ahead. They stared at each other, and something that might have been humor flickered across Mara's face. You're a terrible liar. I'm not lying. I'm provisioning my household. Your household that somehow grew by 7 people. Temporarily grew, Ethan corrected. For which temporary period it makes sense to buy temporary additional supplies. This time she did smile, small but genuine. You're still a terrible liar. That night, Thomas's bird died. Ethan heard the boys sobbing from across the yard, Mara's low voice trying to comfort. He stood on his porch in the darkness, remembering Sarah's grief when her kitten had died, how he'd held her while she cried and told her that loving something was worth the hurt of losing it. The next morning, James appeared at dawn with a small wooden box. Thomas wants to bury the bird proper, with words and everything. Mama said maybe you'd know what to say. They buried the nestling under the cottonwood tree, all 8 of them gathered in the early light. Thomas had lined the box with soft grass. Lily had picked wildflowers. Samuel stood solemn and silent, thumb forgotten for once. Ethan cleared his throat. Sometimes we try our best and things still don't work out the way we hope. But the trying matters. The caring matters. This bird knew warmth and care in its last days because Thomas chose to give that. That's worth something. Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. Clara put her arm around him. They stood together in the morning quiet, and Ethan thought about all the small griefs that shaped a childhood, all the losses that taught you both the cost of loving and the necessity of it. As they walked back to the house, Mara fell into step beside him. Thank you, she said quietly, for understanding that it mattered to him. Everything matters when you're young. We just forget as we get older. Do we? Or do we just pretend we've forgotten, so it hurts less? Ethan didn't have an answer for that. They walked in silence until they reached the porch, where the children had scattered to their various morning tasks. 3 more weeks, Mara said, more to herself than him. Then we move on. But she said it like someone trying to convince herself of something she was no longer sure she believed. And Ethan, watching her walk back to the barn with Daniel on her hip, found himself hoping she'd fail at that particular attempt at conviction. The heat pressed down harder as June deepened toward July. The children adapted, learning the rhythms of ranch life and the particular demands of Wyoming summer. They learned to work early and late, resting during the brutal midday hours when the sun turned the earth into a furnace. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls Mara had built around herself and her family began to crack. She laughed at something Clara said while they weeded the garden. She sat on the porch in the evening, Daniel nursing while she watched the sunset paint the sky impossible colors. She stopped flinching when Ethan spoke to her, stopped watching him with the wariness of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. The children bloomed like plants given water after drought. Color returned to their cheeks. Samuel's thumb left his mouth more often than it entered. James stood straighter, spoke more freely, began to offer opinions instead of just nods. Even Clara, so serious and careful, allowed herself moments of childishness, chasing her siblings, laughing at jokes, singing while she collected eggs. Ethan tried not to notice how the ranch felt right, in a way it hadn't for years. Tried not to acknowledge how he listened for their voices, how his day felt incomplete until he'd checked that everyone was settled for the night. Tried not to think about what 3 weeks from now would feel like when they climbed on that train and disappeared north into whatever future Mara's sister represented. But late at night, lying in his empty bed, he couldn't escape the truth. Temporary was already becoming something else, something more permanent and necessary and terrifying in its implications. And he had no idea what to do about that except let the days unspool toward their inevitable conclusion, each one bringing the family deeper into the fabric of his life while the calendar marched steadily toward their departure. In the barn, Mara lay awake beside her sleeping children and fought the same battle. This wasn't her home. Ethan Cole wasn't her salvation. Montana and her sister represented safety, permanence, a future she could build on something more solid than one man's inexplicable kindness. But her children were happy, they were healing, and she'd started to forget what it felt like to carry everything alone, to make every decision in isolation, to bear the weight of 6 lives without anyone to share the burden. It was dangerous, it was temporary, and it was becoming harder to remember why those 2 facts mattered when every morning she woke to the sound of her children laughing instead of crying, to the sight of them running instead of trudging, to the reality of full bellies and clean clothes and a man who looked at them like people instead of problems. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to shore up her defenses, to remind herself and her children that this was a way station, not a destination. 3 weeks to prepare for the next leg of their journey. 3 weeks that were already starting to feel like not nearly enough time to say goodbye to something she'd never meant to find in the first place. The change came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks to the day since Ethan had found them in Fletcher's alley. He was checking fence line near the road when he saw the dust cloud rising in the distance, heard the rattle of wheels and hoofbeats approaching at a pace too deliberate to be casual travel. Sheriff Thomas Blake rode at the head of a group of 5 men, his bay gelding dark with sweat despite the early hour. Behind him came Harrison Fletcher, Morton Davies, who owned the general store, and 3 others Ethan recognized from town council meetings he rarely attended. They reined up at the fence line, horses stamping and blowing. "Cole." Blake touched the brim of his hat, eyes already scanning past Ethan toward the ranch house and barn visible in the distance. "Sheriff? Gentlemen?" Ethan set down his post-hole digger, kept his voice level. "Something I can help you with?" Blake shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. He was a lean man in his 50s, weathered by years of keeping peace in territory that didn't always want keeping. "Got some questions need answering. Heard you've taken in some drifters. Hired some help for the ranch. That a crime now?" "Depends on the help." Fletcher leaned forward, his butcher's hands gripping his reins too tight. "Woman with 6 kids living in your barn. That's what we heard. News travels fast. Small town," Davies spoke up, his merchant's eyes calculating. "People notice when a man changes his habits. Start buying food for 8 instead of 1. Start bringing a family to his property." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. Still don't hear a question in all this observation. Blake raised a hand, quieting the others. "Here's the question, Cole. Who are they? Where'd they come from? And what exactly is their business on your land? They're people who needed work, and I needed workers. Their business is ranch business, which makes it my business, not yours. It becomes my business when we got drifters of questionable character setting up residence." Fletcher's voice rose. "That woman's been through town before, Cole, begging for scraps, making a spectacle. Now she's living on your property, and folks are wondering what kind of arrangement you got with her." The implication landed like a slap. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "You want to say that plainly, Fletcher?" The butcher's face reddened. "I'm saying it looks improper. A woman with no husband, living on a bachelor's ranch, kids running around half wild, and you, buying supplies like you're outfitting a family. I hired a housekeeper and some help. There's nothing improper about honest work. Then you won't mind us having a look around?" Davies this time, his tone suggesting it wasn't really a request. "Making sure everything's on the up and up." Ethan stepped away from the fence, placing himself squarely between the mounted men and the path to his house. "Actually, I mind very much. This is private property, and unless you've got a warrant, you've got no business on it beyond what I invite." Blake's expression hardened. "Don't make this difficult, Cole. We're here as concerned citizens, making sure what? That I'm not committing the crime of giving people work and shelter?" Ethan's voice stayed quiet, but steel ran through it. "Or making sure I know my place in town hierarchy, and that place doesn't include making decisions about my own land without your approval? Now, hold on. No, you hold on." Ethan took a step forward. "I've lived here 15 years, paid my taxes, kept to myself, never caused a day's trouble. But I give some folks a place to sleep and suddenly I need a committee riding out to inspect my choices? One of the other men, a farmer named Hutchins, spoke up. It's not just about you, Cole. It's about what's right for the community. We got standards to maintain. Standards. Ethan felt something hot and bitter rise in his throat. What standards are those? The ones where we let children sleep in alleys, where we walk past hungry people because acknowledging them might be inconvenient. That's not fair, Davies protested. Isn't it? Every one of you saw that family in town. Every one of you walked right past. But now that someone actually helped them, suddenly you're concerned about standards and propriety. Blake dismounted, moved closer to the fence. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its official edge. Cole, I understand you meant well, but think about what you're doing. A woman alone, kids with no father. They have a mother. That seems sufficient. No papers. No proof of who they are or where they came from. For all you know, she could be running from the law. Could be using those children. She's using them for nothing except surviving. Ethan cut him off. And if you had any real concerns about law breaking, you'd have a warrant instead of a posse of shopkeepers. Fletcher's face had gone from red to purple. This is exactly the kind of attitude that causes problems. You think you're better than the rest of us, Cole? Think you can just ignore how things are done? I think I can hire who I want and house them how I see fit on land I own. If that makes me difficult, so be it. The standoff stretched taut as fence wire. The horses stamped and swished at flies. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk screamed. Then Ethan heard footsteps behind him, turned to see Mara walking up the path from the house, Daniel in her arms and the other children trailing behind like they sensed trouble. She'd changed from her work dress into something slightly better, had tied her hair back with a ribbon Clara must have found somewhere. She walked with her spine straight and her chin up, and when she reached Ethan's side, she met the sheriff's gaze without flinching. Gentlemen, her voice came out clear and steady. I'm Mara Lane. I believe you're here about me. Blake removed his hat. Mrs. Lane, we're just trying to understand the situation here. The situation is simple. Mr. Cole offered my family work and shelter. We accepted. We've been earning our keep through honest labor, bothering no one, breaking no laws. No one's saying you broke laws, ma'am. Blake's tone gentled slightly. But folks have questions about where you came from, where you're headed. We came from Laramie. We're headed to Montana, to my sister's place. Mr. Cole has been kind enough to let us rest and recover before we continue our journey. She shifted Daniel to her other hip. Is there something criminal in that? Davies leaned forward in his saddle. Your husband, Mrs. Lane, where might he be? The question hung in the air like smoke. Mara's expression didn't change, but Ethan saw her hand tighten on Daniel's back. Dead, she said flatly. 18 months now. And you've been traveling alone since then? With 6 children? I've been surviving. With my children. Which sometimes means traveling, sometimes means staying put, sometimes means accepting help when it's offered. Her eyes swept across the mounted men. I've done nothing wrong. My children have done nothing wrong. And Mr. Cole has done nothing except show Christian charity in a world that seems short on it. Fletcher made a disgusted sound. Christian charity, is that what we're calling it? Mara's eyes snapped to him, something dangerous flashing in their depths. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Fletcher? I'm suggesting that a woman alone with a man living on his property, living in his barn, working for room and board, with my children present every moment. She took a step forward, and despite being outnumbered and on foot, she somehow made the mounted men lean back. If you have an accusation to make it plainly. Don't hide behind insinuation. Mara, Ethan's voice was quiet. She glanced at him, and he shook his head slightly. Not worth it, the gesture said. These men aren't worth your anger. But she was already turning back to the sheriff, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the morning air with a clarity that demanded attention. I was married to Thomas Lane for 9 years. He worked a freight line out of Cheyenne. Good man, hard worker, loved his children. She paused, gathering herself. 18 months ago, his wagon team spooked on a mountain pass. He went over the edge trying to control them, died on impact, they told me. The children had gone very still behind her. Clara reached down and took Samuel's hand. We had some savings, Mara continued. Not much, but enough. I tried to make it work in Cheyenne, but without Thomas's income, we couldn't keep the house. I took in washing, mending, any work I could find. Wasn't enough. Landlord put us out 4 months ago. She said it matter of fact, but Ethan could hear the weight beneath the words, the accumulation of small disasters that added up to catastrophe. We went to Laramie because I had friends there, people who knew Thomas, thought maybe they'd help. Her laugh was bitter. They helped for a week, maybe 2. Then we became inconvenient, so we left before we were thrown out again. And you're walking to Montana, Blake said it gently, like he was starting to understand the mathematics of desperation. My sister Ellen married a rancher up near Helena. She wrote me 2 years back, said, if I ever needed anything. Mara trailed off. It's all I have left. All we have left. Davies shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. That's a hard story, Mrs. Lane. But it doesn't change the fact that this arrangement looks like what it is. A woman trying to keep her children alive, and a man decent enough to help without demanding anything in return. She turned to Ethan. Tell them what you asked for in exchange for the barn. Nothing, Ethan said quietly. Tell them what conditions you set. None. Tell them what you've demanded from me or my children beyond honest work. Nothing, Mara turned back to the mounted men. So I'll ask again. What crime has been committed here? What law broken? What sin committed beyond the apparently unforgivable one of accepting help when it was offered? The silence that followed felt heavy enough to bend the fence posts. The men exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable, Fletcher still red-faced and rigid. Finally, Blake cleared his throat. No one's saying crimes were committed, Mrs. Lane. We just needed to understand the situation. And now you do. Now we do. He settled his hat back on his head. Though I expect folks in town will still talk. People always talk, usually about things that are none of their business. Mara's voice had gone flat, tired. We'll be gone in a week anyway. Surely Ridgeway can tolerate our presence that long. A week? Ethan's chest constricted. She'd said 3 weeks before. Had that already compressed to 1? Or had this confrontation changed the timeline, made her want to leave faster? Blake mounted his horse, the others following suit. I suppose there's no harm in a week, but Cole... He fixed Ethan with a stern look. You're putting yourself in a difficult position here. People are going to make assumptions. Let them. It could affect your standing in town, your business relationships. I'll manage. Blake shook his head slowly, something that might have been respect or resignation crossing his face. I expect you will. He gathered his reins. We'll be going then. Mrs. Lane, I hope your journey north goes well. Thank you, Sheriff. The men turned their horses, started back down the road. Fletcher lingered a moment longer, his expression hard. You're making a mistake, Cole. Both of you are. This won't end the way you think it will. Then he too wheeled his horse and cantered after the others, leaving dust hanging in the still air. Ethan and Mara stood side by side, watching until the riders disappeared over the rise. The children remained frozen behind them, barely breathing. When the dust finally settled, Mara's shoulders sagged like someone had cut her strings. I'm sorry. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. I've brought trouble to your door. You didn't bring anything. They did. Because we're here. Because I accepted your help. She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. This is what always happens. People help, then other people object. Then it becomes easier to just move us along rather than deal with the objections. I'm not moving you along. We should go anyway, today, before it gets worse. Where exactly would you go? Town won't take you. Walking to Montana in a week is impossible. So where, Mara? She had no answer. Daniel started to fuss, and she rocked him automatically, her expression distant and defeated. Clara spoke up, her young voice steady despite the tremor underneath. Mama, we don't have to leave, do we? We're doing good work here. We're not causing trouble. Sometimes just existing is trouble enough, sweetheart. Mara's voice cracked on the last word. Ethan looked at the children, at their faces marked with fear and confusion and the particular exhaustion that came from being moved along too many times. He thought about Fletcher's implications, Davies's calculations, Blake's warnings about standing in relationships. Then he thought about sleeping in his empty house while these children slept in an alley somewhere because he'd lacked the courage to withstand gossip. "You're staying," he said firmly. "All of you, for as long as you need." You heard what they said, what they implied. I heard a group of men who've got too much time and too little compassion making noise about things that aren't their concern. He met her eyes. I also heard a woman defend herself and her children with more dignity than any of them deserved. You've got nothing to apologize for and no reason to run. Ethan, it was the first time she'd used his given name. The sound of it stopped them both. I can't ask you to sacrifice your reputation for us, she finished quietly. You're not asking. I'm choosing. He glanced at the children, softened his voice. Go back to the house. All of you. Take the rest of the morning easy. This has been enough excitement for one day. Mara looked like she wanted to argue, but Clara was already tugging at her sleeve. Samuel had started crying quietly, and Daniel needed attention. She nodded once, gathered her children, and walked back toward the barn with the defeated slope of someone who'd fought too many battles and lost too many wars. Ethan returned to his fence work, but his hands shook with anger as he drove posts into the hard ground. Not at Mara or her children, but at a world that punished people for being poor, for being alone, for needing help. At men who rode out in groups to intimidate a widow and orphans. At a town that could look at hungry children and see problems instead of people. He worked until the sun reached its zenith and the heat drove him to the shade of the porch. Mara had left a pitcher of water there, condensation beating on the ceramic. He drank deeply, then saw the note tucked underneath. Thank you for standing with us. For not turning us out when it would have been easier. We'll try to cause you no more trouble. M. The careful script, the formal gratitude, the promise to minimize their existence. It all spoke of someone who'd learned to make herself small, to apologize for taking up space, to be grateful for scraps of basic human decency. Ethan crumpled the note in his fist, then smoothed it out again, read it once more. Then he walked to the barn. He found Mara sitting on a hay bale, mending one of James's shirts with thread that had been used and reused until it was almost too weak to hold. She looked up when his shadow fell across the doorway, and something wary entered her expression. We need to talk, Ethan said. She set down her sewing. All right. Not here. Walk with me. They left the children under Clara's supervision and walked out past the corrals, up the gentle slope to where the land leveled out and you could see clear to the mountains on the horizon. The grass whispered around their ankles. A breeze moved through, too hot to be comfortable, but better than stillness. When they were far enough from the house that their voices wouldn't carry, Ethan stopped. I need you to understand something, he began. What those men said today, what they implied. None of that changes anything. You and your children are welcome here for as long as you need to stay. They'll make your life difficult. My life is already difficult. Has been for 3 years. At least this kind of difficult has purpose to it. Mara looked out at the mountains, her expression unreadable. You say that now, but when the whole town turns against you, when they stop buying your cattle or selling you supplies, when you become an outcast because of us, then I'll drive to the next town for supplies. Sell cattle elsewhere. I've got land and water and enough saved to weather some social disapproval. It's more than disapproval, Ethan. You know what they think, what they're saying. I know what small minds assume when they see something they don't understand. He turned to face her fully. But you and I know the truth. That's what matters. Is it? Her voice rose slightly. Because the truth doesn't feed my children when no one will hire me. The truth doesn't keep them warm when we're run out of town after town. The truth is just words, and words don't change how people treat you. Maybe not, but words can change how you treat yourself. Ethan kept his tone gentle. You keep apologizing for existing, Mara, for taking up space, for needing help, like you've internalized every cruel thing anyone's ever said about people in your situation. Her jaw clenched. You don't know what it's like. No, I don't. I've never been where you are. But I know what I see. A woman who's survived things that would have broken most people, who's kept 6 children alive through circumstances that had no right allowing it, who works harder than anyone I've ever met, and still thinks she doesn't deserve basic kindness. I don't... You do. You apologize constantly. You make yourself small. You promise not to be trouble as if your mere presence is an imposition. He paused, choosing his words carefully. What happened to you, Mara? Before Thomas died, before you lost your home? What happened to make you believe you don't deserve to be treated like a human being? She went very still. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. It doesn't matter. It does to me. Why? She whirled to face him, and there was anger in her eyes now, hurt and fury mixing into something raw. Why do you care? We're nothing to you, temporary workers who'll be gone soon. Why does any of this matter to you? The question hung between them, and Ethan realized he didn't have a good answer. Or rather, he had an answer he wasn't ready to examine too closely, one that involved empty houses and silent meals, and the way his chest felt lighter when he heard children's laughter in his yard. Because you matter, he said finally. You and those children. You matter, and I'm tired of watching the world treat people like they don't. Mara's anger collapsed into something that looked like grief. You can't save us, Ethan. You can't fix what's broken. I'm not trying to save anyone. I'm just trying to do what's right. And what happens when doing right costs you everything? Then it costs me everything. He said it simply, meaning it. I've already lost the things that mattered most to me, my wife, my daughter, my mother-in-law. I've spent 3 years in a house that echoes with their absence, working land that used to be full of life and purpose. If standing up for you means the town doesn't like me anymore, well, they already mostly ignored me anyway. A sound escaped Mara that might have been a laugh or a sob. You're either the best man I've ever met or the most foolish. Probably both. They stood in the heat and the grass, the mountains watching distant and impassive. Finally, Mara spoke again, her voice steadier. My father was a drunk. Mean when he drank, meaner when he didn't. My mother died when I was 12, and he decided I was old enough to take her place, cooking, cleaning, and other things I won't speak of. She said it matter of fact, like reciting someone else's story. I ran away at 15, met Thomas a year later. He was kind, steady, everything my father wasn't. I thought I'd finally found safe. Ethan felt his hands curl into fists, anger for the child she'd been burning in his chest. We had a good life, she continued. Not easy, but good. Then he died, and suddenly I was right back where I started, alone, desperate, at the mercy of people who saw me as either a burden or an opportunity. She met his eyes. So yes, I apologize too much. Yes, I make myself small, because that's how I've survived, by being grateful for scraps, by never asking for too much, by moving on before I wear out my welcome. You haven't worn out your welcome here. Give it time. I always do eventually. Mara, no, listen. She cut him off, urgent now. You've been kind to us, kinder than anyone in years, but kindness isn't enough to build a life on. In a week or two, we'll leave for Montana, and you'll go back to your quiet existence, and this will all be a brief interruption in both our lives. That's how it has to be. Does it? The question seemed to catch her off guard. What else could it be? Ethan didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked, what if your sister's situation has changed? What if she can't take you in? She will. But what if she can't? What's your plan then? Mara's expression flickered. I'll figure something out. I always do. You could stay here. The words fell between them like stones dropped in deep water. Mara stared at him. What? You could stay, work the ranch, help with the house. I'll pay fair wages, provide proper housing, not the barn, but maybe we could add rooms, make something suitable. The children would have stability, schooling in town when it starts up in fall. Ethan, think about it before you refuse. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering employment, proper employment, with wages and security, and what happens when people think what they're already thinking? Her voice rose. When the whole town decides we're living in sin? When my children can't show their faces in town without hearing gossip about their mother? Then we weather it, together. That's not fair to you. Let me decide what's fair to me. They stared at each other, the conversation having veered into territory neither had anticipated. Finally, Mara shook her head. I need to think about all of this. Take your time. I don't have time. We agreed on a month, and it's nearly up. Then we extend the agreement. Ethan, just think about it, he interrupted gently. That's all I ask. Think about whether running to an uncertain future in Montana makes more sense than staying somewhere your children are already settled and safe. He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her standing in the grass with the wind pulling at her skirts and an expression on her face that suggested her carefully constructed plans were crumbling faster than she could rebuild them. That evening, the children were subdued at dinner. Even Samuel stayed quiet, picking at his food. Finally, James spoke up. Are we leaving because of those men? Mara set down her fork. We're leaving because that was always the plan. But why? Lily's voice was small. We like it here. We're happy. I know, sweetheart, but happiness isn't always enough. Why not? Thomas asked, and the simplicity of the question seemed to strip away all the adult complications. Mara looked at her children's faces, at the plea in their eyes. Because the world is more complicated than that. The world's only as complicated as we make it, Clara said quietly, and Mara's head snapped toward her oldest daughter. What did you say? Mr. Cole said that. When I asked him why people made things so hard, he said the world's only as complicated as we make it. And mostly, we make it complicated so we don't have to do the simple, hard things. Mara's eyes closed briefly. When she opened them, they were bright with tears she refused to shed. Mr. Cole is an idealist. Is that bad? James asked. No, it's just difficult to live by when you've got 6 children depending on you. The meal ended in silence. The children cleared the table without being asked, disappeared into their sleeping area. Mara sat alone with Daniel, nursing him in the lamplight, and tried to sort through the impossible tangle her life had become. Stay or go. Security or hope. The known difficulty of Ethan's offer or the unknown possibility of her sister's welcome. Either way, she'd be depending on someone else's generosity, someone else's willingness to shoulder the burden of her family. But here, at least, that generosity had proven itself real. Here, her children laughed. Here, she could sleep without jumping at every sound. Here, a man had stood between her and a hostile world and chosen her side without hesitation. In the house, Ethan sat with his cold coffee and thought about the offer he'd made, the implications of it, the way it had emerged from his mouth before his brain had fully approved it. Asking Mara to stay long-term was complicated, layered with potential pitfalls and certain social consequences. But when he thought about them leaving, about the ranch returning to its previous silence, about going back to eating alone and talking to no one and marking time until death, something in his chest rebelled with a fierceness that surprised him. He'd been alone long enough. He'd grieved long enough. And maybe, just maybe, this family stumbling into his life wasn't random chance, but something closer to Providence offering him a second chance at purpose. The question was whether Mara could see it the same way, or whether fear and pride and a lifetime of disappointments would drive her away from the first real stability she'd found. In the barn, Clara spoke into the darkness where her siblings lay breathing. I don't want to leave. Silence. Then James. Me neither. Me neither, echoed Lily and Thomas together. Mama says we have to, Clara whispered. Mama's scared, James said, with the insight of a child who'd watched his mother navigate impossible situations for too long. She's scared Mr. Cole will turn mean, or the town will make us leave, or something bad will happen. Something bad always happens, Lily said matter-of-factly. Maybe not always. Clara's voice held a thread of hope. Maybe sometimes good things happen too. Maybe we just have to be brave enough to let them. In her corner, Mara listened to her children's whispered conversation and felt something crack in the armor she'd built around her heart. They wanted to stay. They felt safe here, happy here, and she'd been so focused on protecting them from potential hurt that she'd stopped considering what she might be protecting them from, the possibility of home, stability, belonging. But wanting something and being able to keep it were two different things. And Mara had learned the hard way that the world had a way of taking away the things you wanted most, usually when you just started to believe you might actually get to keep them. She closed her eyes and prayed for wisdom she didn't possess, for courage she wasn't sure she had, for the ability to make the right choice when both options felt equally impossible. The decision came 3 days later, though not in the way either of them expected. Ethan was in the north pasture moving cattle when he heard the wagon coming fast down the ridge road, wheels hitting ruts hard enough to rattle boards. He rode to meet it, hand instinctively moving to the rifle in his saddle scabbard before he recognized Doc Brennan's rig. The doctor pulled up hard, his gray mare lathered and blowing. "Cole, thank God. I was hoping you'd be close." Ethan's gut tightened. "What's wrong?" "The lane woman. She needs help." Brennan mopped sweat from his face with a handkerchief. "I was passing by your place, heard one of the children screaming from the road. The baby's burning up with fever, and she's got no medicine, nothing to bring it down." Ethan was already turning his horse. "How bad?" "Bad enough that she sent the oldest girl running to flag me down. Bad enough that I need supplies from my office, and that's 20 minutes back to town." Brennan gathered his reins. "I came to get you first. Didn't think she should be alone with it." They rode hard, Ethan's gelding stretching into a gallop that ate up the distance to the ranch. He could hear crying before he reached the barn, high and frightened and desperate in a way that turned his blood cold. He swung down before his horse had fully stopped, hit the barn door at a run. The scene inside pulled him up short. Mara sat on the floor with Daniel in her arms, rocking him with a mechanical desperation that spoke of hours of trying. The baby's face was flushed dark red, his small body rigid with discomfort, his cries weak and thready. The other children clustered around her like a protective wall, their faces streaked with tears. "Ethan." Mara's voice cracked on his name. "I can't. He won't. The fever won't break." He crossed to her in 3 strides, dropped to his knees, laid the back of his hand against Daniel's forehead. The heat radiating from the infant's skin was terrifying. "How long?" "Since last night. I thought it was just teething, but then this morning he wouldn't nurse, wouldn't take water, just kept crying and burning up." Her hands shook as she tried to adjust the damp cloth on Daniel's forehead. "I don't know what to do. I've tried cool water, I've tried everything I know, but nothing's working." "Doc Brennan's gone for medicine. He'll be back soon." Ethan kept his voice calm despite the fear crawling up his spine. He'd seen fever take children before, had watched Sarah slip away despite everything the doctor tried. "We need to keep him cool until then. Clara, get me the wash basin and fresh water from the pump. James, I need clean cloths, as many as you can find." The children scattered to their tasks, grateful for something to do. Ethan took Daniel from Mara's arms, the baby's small body frighteningly hot, even through his clothes. "We need to get these off him. Cool him down more aggressively." Mara nodded, her hands fumbling with the buttons on Daniel's gown. Between them, they stripped the baby down to his diaper, and Ethan saw the way the infant's chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. "Jesus," he breathed. "Don't!" Mara's voice was fierce. "Don't say it. Don't even think it. He's going to be fine. He has to be fine." Claire returned with the basin, water sloshing over the sides. James brought an armful of clean rags. Working together, they soaked the cloths and laid them across Daniel's body, changing them out as they warmed, trying to draw the heat from his small frame. The baby's cries had gone quiet, which was somehow worse than the screaming. He lay limp in Mara's arms, his eyes glassy and unfocused, his lips dry and cracked. "Come on, little man." Ethan stroked the baby's cheek with one finger. "Stay with us. Your mama needs you to fight." Time stretched strange and slow. Minutes felt like hours as they worked, cooling, soothing, praying in ways neither of them spoke aloud. The other children sat in a tight cluster, Samuel sucking his thumb hard enough to make it bleed, Lily crying silent tears that dripped off her chin. Finally, hoofbeats outside. Doc Brennan burst through the door carrying his black bag, his face grim with the particular expression doctors wore when they knew the odds were poor. "How is he?" "Barely conscious, fever's still high." Ethan moved aside to let Brennan examine the baby. The doctor worked with practiced efficiency, checking pulse and breathing, looking in Daniel's mouth and ears, running experienced hands over the small body. His expression grew grimmer. "It's scarlet fever." He said it quietly, but every person in the barn went still. "I've seen 3 cases this week in town. 2 children, 1 elderly woman." Mara's face went white. "The others? Will they? Might not. It's unpredictable." Brennan was already mixing powders in water. "But right now we focus on this one. Mrs. Lane, I need you to get fluids in him however you can. Even if he won't nurse, try water from your finger, drops at a time. He administered medicine, showed Mara how to measure doses, explained signs to watch for. Then he turned to Ethan, voice dropping. I won't lie to you, Cole. This is bad. Infant this young, fever this high, it could go either way. He paused. She should know. She should be prepared. I'll tell her. But when Brennan left with promises to return in the morning, Ethan found he couldn't form the words. Mara sat with Daniel, dripping water into his mouth, drop by patient drop, singing to him in a voice raw from crying. Her other children had fallen into exhausted sleep around her, and she looked like something carved from stone and grief. Instead of speaking, Ethan simply sat down beside her. Let me take him for a while. You need to rest. I can't. If I stop, if I'm not holding him, he'll still be right here. I promise. Ethan held out his arms, and after a long moment, Mara transferred the baby to him. Daniel felt impossibly light, impossibly fragile. Ethan cradled him against his chest, felt the rapid flutter of the infant's heartbeat, the heat pouring off his small body. He started talking, low and steady, the kind of mindless comfort words you say when words are all you have left to give. You're doing good, Daniel. That's it. Keep breathing. Your mama loves you something fierce, you know that? Your brothers and sisters, too. They're all here, waiting for you to get better. You've got a whole family counting on you. Beside him, Mara's hands twisted in her skirt. This is my fault. How do you figure that? I should have seen it sooner, should have had medicine on hand, should have what? Read the future? You're doing everything right, Mara. Everything humanly possible. It's not enough. Her voice broke. It's never enough. I couldn't save Thomas. Couldn't keep our home. Couldn't keep my children fed. And now I can't even... She stopped, pressing her fist against her mouth. Ethan shifted Daniel to one arm, used the other to pull Mara against his side. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed into him, her body shaking with silent sobs. You've kept 6 children alive through impossible circumstances, he said into her hair. You've survived things that would have destroyed most people. You're the strongest person I know. I don't feel strong. I feel terrified. That's what makes it strength, being terrified and doing it anyway. They sat like that as darkness fell outside, taking turns holding Daniel, cooling him, coaxing drops of water and medicine into him. The children woke periodically, checked their baby brother, returned to fitful sleep. Clara made coffee that no one drank. James brought blankets that went unused. Somewhere past midnight, Daniel's fever broke. It happened so gradually at first that Mara didn't trust it. But Ethan felt the change, the way the baby's skin went from scorching to merely hot, the way his breathing eased from shallow gasps to something more regular. Mara, he touched her shoulder. Feel his forehead. She did, and something that might have been hope flickered across her face. Is it? I think so. They watched with held breath as color slowly returned to Daniel's face, as his eyes focused with more clarity, as he made a sound that wasn't quite crying but suggested he had the strength for it if he wanted. Oh God. Mara took the baby from Ethan, held him close, tears streaming down her face. Oh, thank God. Daniel began to fuss properly then, the irritable cry of a sick baby who was nonetheless going to survive. Mara laughed through her tears, offered her breast, and this time he latched on and nursed with something approaching his normal vigor. The other children woke to their mother's laughter, saw their baby brother nursing, and their faces transformed. Samuel climbed into Mara's lap alongside Daniel. Lily and Thomas pressed close on either side. Clara and James stood behind her, hands on her shoulders, and they all simply breathed together as a family that had faced down death and won. Ethan stood, every muscle stiff from sitting, and walked to the barn door. Dawn was still hours away, but the sky had that particular quality of deep night, stars burning cold and bright overhead. He braced his hands on the doorframe and let the fear drain out of him, replaced by a gratitude so fierce it felt like its own kind of prayer. Behind him, he heard Mara settling the children back to sleep, her voice soft with relief and exhaustion. When the barn had gone quiet again, she came to stand beside him. Thank you. She said it simply, but the words carried weight. for being here, for not leaving me alone with it. I wasn't going to leave. I know, and that's... She paused, searching for words. I've been alone with everything for so long. Having someone else there, someone to share the fear with, it made all the difference. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the night. Finally, Mara spoke again. I've been thinking about what you said, about staying. Ethan's heart kicked in his chest, but he kept his voice neutral. And I'm still not sure it's the right choice, for you or for us. She wrapped her arms around herself. But tonight, when I thought I might lose Daniel, all I could think was that if I did, at least we'd been somewhere safe when it happened. Somewhere we weren't alone. Somewhere someone cared whether we lived or died. I care. I know. That's what scares me. Why? Because caring means risk, means vulnerability, means putting my children's hearts in someone else's hands and trusting they won't crush them. She turned to face him. I've been hurt before, Ethan, badly, and I survived it because I had to, because my children needed me. But if we stayed and something went wrong, something might go wrong, Ethan agreed. That's life. It goes wrong with spectacular regularity, but it also goes right sometimes. And when it does, you've got to be brave enough to recognize it and hold on. Is that what this is? Things going right? He looked at her in the starlight, this woman who'd walked into his life asking for leftovers and somehow become essential. Yeah, I think it is. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then, if we stayed, there would have to be rules, boundaries. I won't have people saying, we'll make it clear. Separate quarters, proper wages, everything above board and documented. You'll be the ranch housekeeper, the children help hands. Nothing improper, nothing the town can legitimately object to. They'll object anyway. Let them. She studied his face, searching for something. Why are you doing this, really? Ethan thought about all the complicated reasons. Loneliness, purpose, redemption, the way the ranch felt alive again with children in it. But what he said was simpler and more honest. Because for 3 years I've been half dead, going through motions, waiting for time to pass until I could be buried next to Sarah and her mother and call it done. Then you showed up asking for scraps, and something in me woke up enough to care again. I'm not ready to go back to being half dead, Mara. Not when there's another option. What if caring about us hurts you? Then it hurts, but it'll be a living hurt, not a dead numbness. I'll take that trade. Mara's eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. You're either very brave or very foolish. We've established that I'm both. This time when she laughed, it was genuine, the sound of it lighter than he'd ever heard from her. All right, she said quietly. We'll stay. But if it becomes too much, if the town makes your life impossible, you have to promise you'll tell us and we'll go. I promise. Though I doubt it'll come to that. I hope you're right. They shook hands on it, formal and serious, sealing an agreement that would change both their lives. Then Mara went back to her children, and Ethan returned to his house as the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern sky. He made coffee, stood at his kitchen window watching the barn, and thought about the future that had just opened up in front of him. It wouldn't be easy. The town would talk, people would judge, there would be difficulties and complications and moments where he'd question the wisdom of this choice. But when he thought about the alternative, sending them away, returning to silence, going back to marking time until death, his chest constricted with something that felt like panic. He'd made his choice, they'd made theirs, and whatever came next, they'd face it together. Doc Brennan returned mid-morning, examined Daniel thoroughly, and pronounced him out of danger. Whatever you did, it worked. Fever's down, breathing's clear, no sign of rash developing. He looked between Ethan and Mara. You got lucky. We had help, Mara said quietly. Brennan packed his bag, accepted payment Ethan pressed on him despite his protests, and paused at the barn door. Word of advice, Cole. The town's already talking about you two. This, he gestured around the barn, is going to add fuel to that fire. Let it burn, Ethan said flatly. The doctor shrugged. Your life. Just don't say I didn't warn you when Blake comes back with more questions. After he left, Ethan helped James with the morning feeding while Mara rested with Daniel. The boy worked in silence for a while, then spoke up. Mr. Cole, Are we really staying? Looks that way. If that's all right with you. James's face split into the first genuine smile Ethan had seen from him. It's more than all right. It's... He stopped, struggling with emotion. It's everything, sir. Just Ethan. If we're going to be working together long term, we can skip the formalities. Ethan, James tested the name. Thank you. For not sending us away, for letting us stay. You're welcome here, James, all of you, for as long as you want. The boy ducked his head, but not before Ethan saw tears on his cheeks. They finished the feeding in companionable silence, and when they were done, James went to tell his siblings the news. The celebration was quiet but joyful. Clara hugged her mother. Lily and Thomas danced around the barn. Even Samuel seemed to sense something good had happened and clapped his small hands together. Only Mara remained subdued, holding Daniel close, her expression thoughtful. When the children had scattered to their various tasks, she approached Ethan. I need to write to my sister. Tell her we won't be coming. You can use the desk in the parlor. There's paper and ink. Thank you. She hesitated. Ethan, I want you to know this decision, staying here, it's not because I've given up on being independent. It's not because I'm looking for someone to take care of us. I know that. I just need you to understand. I'm choosing this because it's what's best for my children, because they deserve stability and safety and a chance to be children instead of survivors. Her voice strengthened. But I'm still their mother. I'm still the one who makes decisions about their welfare. This is a partnership, not a rescue. Understood. And for what it's worth, I never thought I was rescuing you. You've been saving yourself all along. I'm just offering some backup. She nodded, satisfied, then softer. I'm scared, Ethan. Terrified of trusting this, of believing it might actually work. Me too. Really? Really? I'm betting my quiet life and what's left of my reputation on a family I've known for less than a month. That's pretty terrifying when I think about it too hard. Mara smiled slightly. Then maybe we should both stop thinking and just do. Probably wise. She went to write her letter, and Ethan returned to ranch work, but something had shifted between them. Some final wall had come down in the crucible of Daniel's illness. They weren't strangers anymore, weren't even just employer and employee. They were two people who'd chosen to build something together, fully aware of the risks and complications, but willing to try anyway. That afternoon, Clara found Ethan mending tack in the barn. She sat down beside him, picked up a piece of leather, examined it with the careful attention she gave everything. Mr. Ethan, can I ask you something? Sure. Why us? Out of everyone you could have helped, everyone who might have needed it, why did you choose us? Ethan set down his tools, considering the question. You remember that first day in the alley behind Fletcher's shop? Yes, sir. You looked at me like you didn't expect anything, but you hoped anyway. Like you'd learned not to count on kindness, but refused to stop believing in it entirely. He paused. You reminded me of my daughter. She used to look at the world that way, clear-eyed about the hard parts, but hopeful about the good parts. I'd forgotten what that looked like until I saw it in you. Clara was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry about your daughter. Me too, but having you all here, it's helped. Doesn't replace what I lost, but it fills some of the empty spaces. We won't let you down, Clara said with the fierce seriousness of a child making a promise. We'll work hard, be good, make you proud you let us stay. You already make me proud, just by being who you are. She threw her arms around him in a sudden hug, and Ethan felt his throat tighten. This was what he'd signed up for, not just labor and logistics, but emotional investment, caring about these children, being cared about in return. It was terrifying and wonderful and more alive than he'd felt in years. As the day faded toward evening, Mara finished her letter and sealed it with wax. Ethan would post it tomorrow when he went to town for supplies. It felt like closing one door and opening another, stepping into an unknown future with nothing but faith and courage to guide them. That night, the family gathered for supper in the barn. Daniel sleeping peacefully in his cradle, his fever gone and color returned. They ate stew and bread, and the conversation flowed easy and natural, punctuated by laughter, and the kind of comfortable silences that only came with familiarity. Ethan sat with them, no longer maintaining the separation between house and barn, between employer and employees. They were becoming something else now, something that didn't have a neat label but felt right in ways that transcended definition. After the children had settled to sleep and Mara was finishing evening chores, Ethan stood in the barn doorway one last time before heading to the house. Mara joined him, and they looked out at the ranch together, at land that was becoming home for all of them. "Tomorrow the real work starts," Mara said, "making this official, dealing with whatever the town throws at us." "Tomorrow," Ethan agreed. "But tonight, we rest. Tonight, we just be grateful we made it through." "Grateful," Mara echoed. "Yes, that's exactly what I am." She went inside, and Ethan walked back to his house under stars that seemed brighter than usual, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Whatever storms were coming, they'd weather them together. And that made all the difference. The storm arrived on Friday, exactly 1 week after Daniel's fever broke. Ethan was in town posting Mara's letter when he noticed the cluster of men outside the sheriff's office. Blake stood in the center, Fletcher and Davies flanking him like bookends, and half a dozen others Ethan recognized from the previous visit to his ranch. They went quiet when they saw him, the kind of silence that precedes trouble. Blake stepped forward. "Cole, we need to talk." "So talk." "Not here. Inside." Ethan followed him into the office, acutely aware of the men filing in behind them, filling the small space with bodies and hostile intent. Blake settled behind his desk, gestured to a chair Ethan didn't take. "I'll stand." "Suit yourself." Blake folded his hands on the desk, his expression carefully neutral. "I've received a formal complaint, multiple complaints actually, about the situation at your ranch." "What situation would that be?" "A woman of questionable morals living on your property, children being exposed to an improper environment, the whole arrangement being a scandal to the community." Ethan felt heat rise in his chest. Questionable morals. That's what you're calling a widow trying to keep her children fed? Fletcher stepped forward. "We're calling it what it looks like, Cole. A woman living alone with a man, no legal arrangement, children as convenient cover for—" "Finish that sentence." Ethan's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Go ahead. Say exactly what you're implying." Fletcher's jaw worked, but he stayed silent. Davies picked up where he left off, his merchant's tone more reasonable but no less damning. "The point is, appearances matter, and this appears improper. We've got families in town asking questions. Parents wondering if they should let their children associate with the Lane kids when they start school. Business owners concerned about—" "About what?" Ethan cut him off. "About a woman who's done nothing wrong except survive circumstances that would have broken most people? About children who've committed no crime except being born poor?" "It's not about them specifically," Blake tried. "It's about standards, about maintaining certain expectations in the community." "Standards." Ethan felt something snap inside him, the careful control he'd maintained for 3 years fracturing under the weight of accumulated injustice. "Let me tell you about your standards, Sheriff. Your standards let a family sleep in an alley for 3 days while good Christian folk walked right past. Your standards decided that hungry children weren't worth a handful of food scraps. Your standards measure human worth by bank accounts and marriage certificates instead of character and courage." "Now hold on." "No, you hold on." Ethan's voice rose. "Mara Lane is the hardest working person I've ever met. She's raising 6 children alone after losing her husband. She's asking for nothing except a chance to earn her keep and keep her family together. And you're standing here telling me that's somehow immoral?" "What's immoral is a woman living under a man's roof without proper sanction," Fletcher snapped. "You can dress it up however you want, Cole, but everyone knows what that means." "Everyone knows nothing." Ethan took a step toward the butcher, saw him flinch. "You want to know what it means? It means I hired a housekeeper. It means I have workers helping on the ranch. It means I'm paying fair wages for honest labor. There's nothing improper about it except in the minds of people looking for scandal where none exists." Blake stood, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Cole, calm down. We're just trying to understand." "Understand this?" Ethan turned to face the sheriff directly. "Mara Lane and her children are staying on my ranch. They're working for wages, living in separate quarters, conducting themselves with more propriety than half this town manages on Sunday. If you've got actual laws being broken, charge me. Otherwise, get out of my business." "It's not that simple," Davies said. There are social considerations, reputation, the impact on the community. The impact on the community. Ethan felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. You want to talk about impact? Let's talk about the impact of letting children go hungry, of turning away widows, of deciding that following arbitrary social rules matters more than basic human decency. Those are different situations, Fletcher protested. Are they? Because from where I stand, they're all part of the same problem. Good people doing nothing while bad things happen because it's easier than standing up. Silence fell heavy in the office. The men shifted uncomfortably, some looking away. Finally, Blake spoke, his tone weary. What do you want from us, Cole? I want you to leave us alone. Stop looking for problems where there aren't any. Stop making a woman and her children feel like criminals for trying to survive. Ethan paused. And if you can't do that, at least have the decency to say you're objecting because you don't like poor people, not because you're concerned about morality. That's not fair, Davies said, but his voice lacked conviction. Fair. Ethan laughed without humor. You want to talk about fair? Nothing about Mara's situation is fair. Her husband dying wasn't fair. Losing her home wasn't fair. Walking 150 miles with 6 children because no one would help wasn't fair. But she did it anyway, with dignity and strength most of you couldn't comprehend, and now you're standing here questioning her morals because she accepted help when it was finally offered. He looked at each man in turn, letting them see his contempt. If you've got legal grounds to remove them, do it. If not, this conversation is over. Blake studied him for a long moment. You're putting yourself in an impossible position, Cole. The town won't accept this. Then the town can go to hell. Ethan walked out, leaving shocked silence behind him. He collected his supplies, loaded the wagon, and drove back to the ranch with his hands shaking on the reins. The confrontation had been inevitable, but the depth of his anger surprised him. He'd spent 3 years keeping his head down, avoiding conflict, accepting the town's judgment about how he should grieve and live. But something about defending Mara and her children had broken through that careful neutrality, revealing reserves of conviction he'd forgotten he possessed. When he reached the ranch, Mara was hanging laundry, Daniel strapped to her back in a sling she'd fashioned from old fabric. She took one look at his face and set down the basket. What happened? He told her everything, watching her expression shift from concern to anger to something that might have been despair. When he finished, she sat down on the porch steps like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. They're going to make you choose, she said quietly. The ranch or us. You're standing in town or your conscience. There's no choice to make. You're staying. Ethan, you don't understand what you're risking. If the whole town turns against you, let them turn. I don't need them. I need... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Need what? This. He gestured at the ranch, at the children playing in the yard, at her sitting on his porch with her baby on her back. I need this to mean something. Need to know I stood up when it mattered. Need to believe there's more to life than just existing until I die. Mara's eyes filled with tears. You're going to lose everything. I've already lost everything that mattered. This is about choosing what comes next. He sat down beside her. I'm not giving up on you, on any of you. Whatever they throw at us, we'll handle it. You say that now? I'll say it tomorrow and the day after and every day until they give up or I'm dead. Whichever comes first. She laughed, the sound broken but genuine. You're the most stubborn man I've ever met. I prefer determined. They sat in silence, watching the children. Claire was teaching Lily to braid grass. James had Samuel on his shoulders, walking around the yard. Thomas chased chickens with the particular intensity of a 4-year-old on a mission. They're happy here, Mara said softly. For the first time in so long, they're just children. Not survivors, not refugees, just children playing and laughing and being safe. Then we protect that, whatever it takes. What if it takes everything? Then it'll be worth it. Mara reached over and took his hand, squeezed it once. Thank you for fighting for us, for not making us leave. Thank you for staying, for giving me something worth fighting for. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was quite ready to name. Then Daniel fussed, breaking the spell, and Mara stood to tend to him. That evening, as Ethan was finishing chores, a rider approached. He recognized Pastor William's gray mare before he saw the man himself. The preacher dismounted slowly, his weathered face grave. "Evening, Ethan." "Pastor, mind if we talk?" They walked to the fence line, far enough from the house that their voices wouldn't carry. Pastor William was quiet for a long moment, studying the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I heard about the meeting with Blake," he finally said. "About the complaints. Come to add your voice to the chorus? Come to tell you I think you're doing the right thing." Ethan turned, surprised. The pastor smiled slightly. "Don't look so shocked. Some of us still remember what faith is supposed to look like." He leaned against the fence. "I've been preaching charity and compassion for 20 years in this town. You're the first person in a long time who actually practiced it without asking what it would cost first. It's costing plenty now. Worth it though, isn't it?" The pastor's eyes were kind. "I've watched you these past 3 years, Ethan. Watched you fade into yourself, going through motions, existing but not living. These past weeks you've come alive again. That's worth fighting for." The town doesn't agree. The town is afraid. Change always scares people, and you're changing the comfortable narrative they've built about how things should be. He paused. "But not everyone agrees with Blake and Fletcher. There are those of us who see what you're doing and want to support it." "Who?" "Doc Brennan, for one. He's been telling everyone who'll listen that Mrs. Lane is a decent woman fallen on hard times. Martha Henderson agrees. She's been shamed into silence for now, but she's on your side. And there are others, not many, but enough to matter." The information settled something in Ethan's chest. "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for giving me something to believe in again. Faith without action is dead, the scriptures say. You're putting feet to your faith, and that's rarer than it should be." The pastor straightened. "I won't keep you. Just wanted you to know you're not alone in this fight." After he left, Ethan stood watching stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Not alone. The words echoed in his mind, offering comfort he hadn't realized he needed. The next week brought smaller confrontations. Shopkeepers who suddenly couldn't make change when Ethan came to their counters. Neighbors who looked away rather than nod greeting. Whispers that followed him down the street. But it also brought unexpected allies. Doc Brennan made a point of stopping by the ranch, examining Daniel again and pronouncing him thriving. Martha Henderson left a basket of preserves on the porch with a note saying only, "For the children." And Pastor William mentioned the Lane family in his Sunday sermon, praising those who showed mercy to strangers. The town began to fracture along invisible lines, those who condemned and those who quietly supported. It wasn't a clean split, and the supporters were definitely outnumbered, but they existed. That mattered. 10 days after the confrontation in Blake's office, Mara received a letter. She opened it at breakfast, read it in silence, then set it down with shaking hands. "It's from my sister." Ethan looked up from his coffee. "And?" "She says her husband lost the ranch last fall. They've moved to Seattle, living in a boarding house, barely making ends meet themselves." Mara's voice stayed level, but Ethan could hear the effort it took. "She says she's sorry, but she can't take us in. There's no room, no money, no way to support 6 more people." The children went very still. Clara's hand found James's under the table. "So Montana was never an option," Mara continued quietly. "All this time, I was walking toward a future that didn't exist anymore. If I'd made it there..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "But you didn't make it there," Ethan said gently. "You made it here instead. By accident, by chance. Does it matter how it happened?" Mara looked at him across the table, and something in her expression shifted. "No, I suppose it doesn't." "So you'll stay? No more talk about leaving?" "I'll stay. If you'll still have us, knowing that Montana isn't waiting as a backup plan, knowing that this is permanent, not temporary. I'll have you, all of you, for as long as you'll stay." The children erupted in cheers. Samuel climbed into Mara's lap. Lily hugged Clara. Thomas and James high-fived with the enthusiasm of boys who'd been given everything they'd hoped for. Only Mara remained quiet, and when Ethan met her eyes, he saw gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that looked like the beginning of trust. That afternoon, Ethan rode into town alone. He went straight to the courthouse, filed papers establishing Mara as an official employee with wages and terms of employment. He had everything notarized, documented, made legal and binding. Then he went to Blake's office. The sheriff looked up when Ethan entered, wariness crossing his face. "I've got something for you." Ethan dropped the papers on the desk. "Employment contract between myself and Mrs. Mara Lane. Terms of work, wages, housing arrangements, everything spelled out legal and proper. She's my employee working for fair compensation. Anyone who wants to question it can read the contract." Blake scanned the documents, his expression unreadable. "This is pretty thorough. I know how to protect what's mine." "Is that what she is? Yours?" "She's under my protection. That make her mine in any way that matters." Ethan leaned on the desk. "Now you can tell Fletcher and Davies and anyone else who asks that everything is legal, documented, and none of their damn business." Blake set down the papers, studied Ethan for a long moment. "You really care about them." "I do." "Even knowing what it's costing you?" "Especially knowing that." The sheriff nodded slowly. "All right then, I'll spread the word. Won't stop the talk, but it might quiet some of the louder voices. That's all I'm asking." Ethan walked out feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The battle wasn't over, might never be fully over, but he'd drawn his line in the sand clearly enough that even the most determined gossips would have to acknowledge it. When he returned to the ranch, he found Mara in the garden with the children, showing them how to tell when vegetables were ready for harvest. She looked up at his approach, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "Where did you go?" "Made things official. We've got a legal employment contract now. Anyone who questions your presence here will have to go through documented proof of propriety." Understanding dawned on her face. "You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, I did. For you, for the children, and for myself. Now everyone knows where we stand." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt, and crossed to where he stood. "Ethan Cole, you are either the best man I've ever known or the most foolish. We've established that I'm both." This time when she smiled, it reached her eyes, transforming her face into something beautiful. "Yes, I suppose we have." The summer deepened, days blending into weeks as the ranch settled into new rhythms. The children thrived, growing stronger and more confident. Clara took over the chickens entirely, coaxing record egg production. James became Ethan's shadow, learning ranch work with the intensity of someone who'd found his calling. Even Samuel stopped sucking his thumb, running wild with Thomas in the games only small boys understood. And Mara bloomed like something that had finally found the right soil. Color returned to her cheeks. Laughter came easier. The hard edges of constant wariness smoothed into something softer, though she never lost the core of steel that had carried her through impossible times. The town's hostility gradually cooled to grudging acceptance. Most people still kept their distance, but the active opposition faded. A few even began to nod greetings again when Ethan came to town. It wasn't forgiveness or approval, but it was tolerance, and that was enough. One evening in late July, Ethan found Mara on the porch after the children had gone to bed. She was mending again, always mending, her hands never idle. He sat down beside her, coffee cup warming his palms. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked, without looking up from her stitching. "Next how?" "After summer. When winter comes and everything gets harder. When the children need schooling and proper clothes and all the things I can't give them on housekeeper's wages. We'll manage." "Will we, though?" She set down her mending, finally meeting his eyes. "I'm grateful for everything you've done, Ethan, more grateful than I can express. But I worry about becoming a burden you can't sustain." "You're not a burden." 6 children and a woman who comes with more complications than help. That's a burden by any definition. Ethan set down his coffee, chose his next words carefully. What if there was a way to make it easier, to give the children legitimacy, security, a future that didn't depend on the charity of strangers? Mara went very still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've been alone for 3 years. You've been alone for longer. The children need a father, or at least someone who can stand in that role legally. And He stopped, gathered courage. "I need a family. Need people to care about, to work for, to build something with." "Ethan." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm not asking for romance or love or anything you're not ready to give. I'm asking for partnership, a marriage of convenience that gives your children my name and protection, gives me the right to provide for you without town gossip, gives all of us a legitimate foundation to build on. Mara stood abruptly, walked to the porch railing, gripped it with white-knuckled hands. Ethan waited, heart pounding, terrified he'd pushed too far too fast. "You don't know what you're asking," she finally said. "I think I do." "No." She turned to face him, and there were tears on her cheeks. "You're asking to tie yourself to a woman who comes with 6 children, a mountain of emotional damage, and more complications than any reasonable man would accept. You're asking to give up any chance of finding real love, real partnership, because you feel sorry for us." "I don't feel sorry for you. I feel—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "I feel alive when you're around. Feel like I have purpose again. The ranch makes sense when there are people in it. The work matters when it's feeding more than just me. And when I think about going back to how things were before, when it was just me and silence and waiting to die, I can't breathe. That's not love, Ethan. That's loneliness. Maybe, but maybe that's enough to start with. Maybe we build from there." She studied his face in the lamplight, searching for something he hoped she'd find. "What about Sarah? Your daughter? You're still grieving them." "I'll always grieve them, but they're gone, and I'm still here, and eventually I have to choose between honoring their memory by remaining frozen or honoring it by living again." He stood, crossed to where she stood. "I think they'd want me to live. And if I can't give you what you need, if I'm too damaged, too broken, then we'll be broken together, better than being broken alone." Mara laughed through her tears. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple. Not easy, but simple. Do you want to stay here? Do you want your children to have a future? Do you trust me enough to believe I won't hurt you or them?" "Yes to all of those things, but Ethan—" "Then marry me. Let me give you and the children my name. Let us build something together, whatever that looks like. No expectations beyond partnership and mutual respect. The rest we'll figure out as we go." She closed her eyes, and he could see her warring with herself, fear against hope, caution against the desperate need for security. When she opened them again, something had shifted. "All right," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Relief flooded through him so powerfully his knees almost buckled. "You will?" "I will. Not because I love you. I'm not ready for that. Might never be ready for that. But because you're good and kind and my children deserve a father who will protect them. Because I'm tired of being afraid all the time. Because you're offering something real, and I'd be a fool to refuse. That's enough. That's more than enough." They stood on the porch in the summer night, 2 broken people choosing to build something new from their combined fragments. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't romance. But it was real and honest and braver than either of them felt. They were married the following Saturday in Pastor William's church. A simple ceremony with Doc Brennan and Martha Henderson as witnesses. The children stood in the front row wearing their best clothes, freshly mended and cleaned. Clara cried. James stood soldier straight with pride. The younger ones fidgeted but stayed quiet. When Pastor William pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed Mara's cheek gently, and she squeezed his hand in return. No grand gestures, no passionate declarations, just 2 people making a promise to face whatever came next together. The town's reaction was mixed. Some called it scandalous, a rushed marriage that confirmed their worst suspicions. Others saw it as Ethan doing the honorable thing, making honest what had appeared improper. Most simply shrugged and moved on, deciding it was none of their business after all. Ethan moved Mara and the children from the barn to the house, converting the parlor and spare rooms into proper bedrooms. He gave Mara the main bedroom while he took the small room off the kitchen, maintaining propriety even in marriage. She didn't question it, seemed relieved by the continued boundaries. Fall came, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The children started school, facing some teasing but holding their heads high, as Coles now, with a father's protection behind them. James proved gifted with numbers. Clara discovered a love of reading. The younger ones made friends slowly but surely, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the household transformed from arrangement to family. Ethan taught James to ride properly. Mara baked bread that filled the house with warmth. The children called him Pa without being asked, the title emerging naturally from comfort and affection. One evening in October, Ethan found Mara sitting by the fire, Daniel asleep in her lap, her expression peaceful. He sat down across from her, and she smiled. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing us. In that alley, when everyone else looked away, you saw us as people worth helping. You saved our lives, Ethan. You saved your own lives. I just gave you a place to rest while you did it. No, you gave us more than that." She looked around the room, at the children's drawings on the wall, at the toys scattered across the floor, at all the evidence of life reclaimed. "You gave us home, family, a future. That's everything." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "You gave me those things too. I was just too stubborn to admit how much I needed them." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the house settling around them with the particular sounds of contentment. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent, covering the ranch in white. "Ethan," Mara's voice was tentative. "Yeah? I'm not ready yet for," she gestured vaguely, "for everything that marriage usually means, but I want you to know that I'm grateful, and maybe someday there's no rush. We've got time." "Do we?" "We've got all the time in the world." She nodded, relief evident on her face. "All right then. Time." Winter deepened, the ranch hunkering down against Wyoming's fierce cold, but inside the house, warmth flourished. The children grew and laughed and fought and made up the way siblings do. Mara's hands grew less nervous, her smiles more frequent, and Ethan found that somewhere in the daily routine of family life, the arguments over chores, the help with homework, the bedtime stories and morning chaos, he'd stopped just existing and started truly living again. On Christmas morning, they gathered around the tree Ethan and the boys had cut from the north pasture. Presents were modest, carved toys, knitted mittens, books from the general store. But the children's joy was boundless. Mara gave Ethan a shirt she'd made, the stitching perfect and precise. He gave her a music box he'd ordered from a catalog, knowing how she hummed while she worked. When she opened it and heard the delicate melody, tears spilled down her cheeks. "It's beautiful." "So are you." The words surprised them both. Mara looked up, and for the first time since they'd met, something other than wariness or gratitude filled her eyes. Something that might have been the beginning of affection, of trust deepening into something more. "Ethan, She stopped, searching for words. "It's all right. You don't have to say anything. But I want to." She set down the music box, took his hand. "I want you to know that this, us, it's becoming more than arrangement for me. I don't know what to call it yet, but it's real, and it matters, and I'm grateful every day that you were the one standing in that alley." "Me too," he said hoarsely. "Me too." The children had stopped opening presents to watch them, and Clara spoke up, her voice knowing beyond her years. "You love each other." Mara and Ethan looked at each other, the truth of it settling over them like the snow outside, quiet, transformative, covering everything in new possibility. "Yeah," Ethan said softly. "I think maybe we do." Mara nodded, tears and laughter mixing. "Against all odds and better judgment, I think we do." The children cheered, and the moment dissolved into chaos as they demanded hugs and celebrated this new certainty. And later, when the house had quieted and the children slept, Ethan and Mara sat together by the dying fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, and spoke of the future they were building together. It hadn't been what either of them expected. It certainly wasn't what the town had anticipated when Ethan first brought them home from Fletcher's Alley. But it was real and hard-won, and more precious for having been built from broken pieces into something whole. Outside, the snow fell steady and clean, covering the ranch in white promise. Inside, a family that had started with a question about leftovers sat warm and safe, bound not just by legal papers or social convention, but by choice and courage, and the simple radical act of refusing to give up on each other. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the Wyoming mountains and lit the world in shades of gold, they would wake together and face whatever came next as a family, imperfect, complicated, and absolutely unbreakable. The heat of that first summer had given way to winter's peace, and what had begun as mercy had transformed into love. Not the easy kind that came without cost, but the kind forged in fire and hardship and the daily choice to stand together against a world that hadn't made it easy. That was the kind of love that lasted. That was the kind of love worth fighting for. And as Ethan pulled Mara closer and felt her settle against him with the trust of someone who'd finally found home, he knew with absolute certainty that every difficult choice, every confrontation, every moment of standing against the tide had led to this. To family, to love, to life reclaimed from the ashes of loss, to everything that mattered.